1940 is a rough marker of that emergence. Modernism started to decline at around 1940. Although the contemporary reformist response to the much more complex intellectual, social, economic, cultural, and political climate of the post-colonial second half of the 20th century is underpinned by early modernist endeavors, it represents a new stage in the modernization of Islam because of its multiple frames of reference. The proponents of this multi-stranded and multi-layered reformulation of Islam identify themselves as progressive Muslims. Slide 9. This morning, I shall attempt to describe very briefly, you hear Bishop, two salient features of progressive Islam. The renegotiations of sacred meaning around the key issues of gender justice and pluralism. However, in order to adequately capture the nuances, internal tensions, and admixtures of progressive Islam, it is necessary to start with an exploration of the debates and dilemmas of definitions. And by the way, I would like to mention to you that this presentation is very different from my paper. So, what's in a name? The term Islam is a key element in Muslim thought. Next slide. It is both ambiguous and complex. As a term of definition, Islam has fluid meanings. Besides the religion, it connotes many things, such as the worldview, culture, history, and civilization of Muslims. As an object of classification, it may be used to articulate a multiplicity of positions and ideological constructs. This internal discursiveness of Islam raises two questions. Why was the label Progressive Islam chosen? And what does Progressive Islam add to the corpus of Islam? Omid Safi admits that the choice of the term progressive is open to criticism, but it is done intentionally. The term progressive, he says, is far from perfect, because that problematic progress embedded so deeply in it may have connotations of hypocrisy, arrogance, and elitism, but there exists no better word. Like Safi, the jurist Khaled Abu al-Fadl acknowledges the difficulties of choosing the right terminology to label a set of beliefs and convictions, because labels do not just describe, they also judge. Although al-Fadl finds the term progressive helpful, he prefers the term moderate, simply because it has roots in Islamic tradition by virtue of the fact that it has been used to describe the Prophet himself, who was a man who tended to avoid falling into extremes. And many of you would disagree here. Safi locates progressive Islam in the tension between classical patriarchal understanding of Islamic thought and practices and reductionist perspectives which advocate an epistemological rupture with the traditional Muslim heritage. Safi writes, at the opposite ends of the spectrum of contemporary Muslims grappling with tradition, one finds rigid extremes. On one side, a steadfast conservative traditionalism, and on the other, a knee-jerk rejectionism of the traditional Muslim heritage by certain Muslim modernists. Conservative traditionalism sees all Muslims as bound by what it deems the authoritative juridical or theological decisions of the past. The reductionist perspective calls for abolishing the Islamic legal and theological schools of thought. He further explains, being progressive, slide 60, means to issue an active and dynamic challenge to those who hold exclusivist, violent, or misogynist interpretations. Over the centuries, the Quran has been subject to numerous interpretations. However, not all interpretations have equal integrity in the legitimacy in the history of Quranic exegesis. the most powerful and authoritative interpretative body of Quranic scholarship is designated by the term tafsir. The aim of the traditional tafsir as a whole was to disclose the Quran norms to the faithful, to explicate in detail in what manner they were called to discern truth and achieve goodness. The traditional works of tafsir have been central in defining the implication of religious imperatives for human existence. Thus, they are a critical understanding of Muslim self-understanding. They reflect the dynamic interaction between sacred text, consciousness, and social reality, and constitute the primary reservoir of Islam's ethico-spiritual heritage. The call by progressive Muslims for a critical examination and rereading of the Quran, which focuses on the ethics of transformation, justice, and liberation of the text, collides with these authoritative interpretations. Such a call to free the Quran from the grasp of its traditional interpreters is also an invitation to Muslim believers to engage with their sacred text. As Mabalas notes, the authority to interpret the Quran derives from the Quran itself, not from public sanction or reason or existing structures of interpretive authority among Muslims. So, what progressive Islam is not? Safi defines the term progressive within carefully articulated dimensions. Progressive Muslims are not liberal Muslims because they insist on a deep engagement with the inherited Islamic traditions of thought and practice. Indeed, progressive Muslims consciously identify themselves as Muslims as they appropriate their historical and sacred textual traditions to construct a vision of the future of Islam. Progressive Muslims see themselves as the faith community which has been challenged with and has fully assumed the responsibility of bearing the message of God as revealed in the Quran. It seems, though, that in the field of definitions, in the academic study of Islam, the field of definitions, rather, is still evolving because there is no consensus on the application of the term liberal. For Kurtzman, the Muslim scholars who use their religious tradition as a base to promote opposition to theocracy, support of democracy, guarantees of rights of women and non-Muslims in Islamic countries, defense of freedom of thought, and belief in the potential for human progress fall into the category of liberal Islam, although they do not necessarily self-identify as liberals. It does acknowledge, however, that the use of the term liberal is not without its limitations. On the other hand, Bassam Tibi, who takes a stand against fundamentalism on Islamic grounds, describes himself as a devout Muslim liberal. Drawing from the experience of his own struggle against the evil of apartheid in South Africa, Isaac, for whom I have a lot of respect, contends that the critical distinction between progressive Islam and liberal Islam concerns their primary subject of discourse. Slide 20. While progressive Muslims focus on the non-subjects of history, liberal Muslims run the risk of functioning as extensions of the dominant classes because their Islam is not grounded in lived realities. Echoing Isaac's emphasis on the transformation of non-subjects of history, Safi completes his definition of the term progressive by stating categorically that progressive Muslims are not critical Muslims, since they are not a bunch of whiners who sit around and complain, pontificating about Islam without the attempt to change realities in Muslim societies on the ground level. Progressive Muslims, Safi adds, realize, 24, the urgency of the changing times in which we live and seek to implement the divine injunction to enact the justice, adl, and goodness and beauty, isham, that lie at the heart of the Islamic tradition. 25. For progressive Muslims, this alignment with the marginalized and oppressed means the identification of areas of concern, activism, and mobilization. And by the way, that is also Faraday's